if you think about, the organizational flinch, hey, we've had something happen, and like somebody just punched us in the face organizationally, and we rear back, we flinch. That now creates time. That now creates space. That now, and now we're getting further right of the incident. And I know everyone wants to get left of bang and all those things, but I think what we need in order to get left of an incident, we first need to be able to understand, how do we get through the incident immediately? How do we fight the flinch response organization? How do we practice? How do we bring all the people to the table so that in something happens in the organization that's risk-based, we're immediately going into what we've trained, what we've talked about, the education and the culture we've built to say, we've got this. Everybody gets together, silos are off the table. And in a happy world, we're looking at the risk from the same way. And we're saying, okay, boss, this has just happened. Here's what we think. Here's the options. Tell us which one you want us to go with, and we'll do it.
I'm excited to welcome Chuck Randolph to Defender, Chief Security Officer at Ontic with an extensive background in security. Chuck, welcome to Defender.
Brother, Dave, thank you. Thank you for having me. Welcome to all the Defender community, everyone listening in. Appreciate you taking time to have me on the show.
Absolutely. So we were talking last week about insider threats, and this is insider threat awareness. So I thought this would dovetail as a good kickoff in terms of a topic. But before we just jump into it, I thought, we could give the Defender audience a quick snapshot of your background and the work you're doing there at Ontic.
Oh, man. Well, I'm a chief security officer at Ontic, which is started as a protective intelligence platform. And now it provides, it helps enable transformation of organizations and becomes a system of record for companies and multinationals that are trying to bring all their security and their risks into one area so that we can get a common operating picture. I mean, anyone listening on the podcast understands, like, we as a community, as protectors and defenders, what's one thing we do well is we work through crises. And a lot of times in crises, you need common operating information, common operating language. That gives you a common operating picture. So that's a lot of what the platform does. I'm also super involved in the community. I'm one of the founders and the past president of the International Protective Security Board. I've been on the board of the Association of International Risk Intelligence Professionals. I started a group called the Corporate Protection Leadership Council a few decades ago. I'm a veteran. Spent 30 years, most of that in the Guard and Reserves, in information operations and the infantry community. Got out as a lieutenant colonel, decorated with Valor once, Legion of Merit, all that kind of stuff. And I'm very passionate about the industry and very passionate about the Defender community as well.
Well, it's a heck of a background, Chuck. So
I think it's the first day. That's the first time I've ever given like a fuller background other than like, this is what I do. So I don't know how you coax that out of me, but good job, my friend.
Hey, we needed that, right? So just to give people some context of what we're going to be covering. But, if we just kick off just the idea of insider threats, giving people sort of an overview of, what qualifies as an insider threat, especially within physical security, and how to mitigate that.
I think there was a time in which when people thought, as well as a military background and where I am now, I spent, a good chunk of my career in a multinational. I ran executive protection, global intelligence. I had the protective intel team. I also had the event risk management team. My team supported things like prototypes. Then I spent a few years working to start a strategic intelligence team. And when I first started in that corporate career, Dave, a lot of it was like insider threat, or insider risk, as I prefer to call it, was a cyber issue. But I think what we're finding more and more is that it's an all of issue, if that makes sense. It's not just cyber, it's not just physical, it's all of, or it's an organizational risk, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And you think, as you go back to like maybe historically, you think about like the Trojan War, Benedict Arnold or somebody, and you think about this historic insider risks that became insider threats. One thing that wasn't present then that is present now with social media, the ease of information to come in and go out. And I just think it's something that every security leader, I don't want to say struggles, but it needs to be on the top of their priority list if you think in terms of like priorities and requirements.
What type of insider threats are you seeing, at least maybe in your career, but especially now in current date and time?
Well,
just what type of threats?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you could think in terms of I'm a threat because maybe I've developed some IP for your organization, Dave. And I feel that now that baby's mine because I developed it, even though I collect the check from you every week. And because I collect the check, that IP, is dave.co. And then one day I decide to leave and I think, well, I'm going to take all this with me. There's insider threats like that. There's insider threats such as we've seen lately where, hey, I'm the assistant to the attorney general somewhere, and maybe I'm actually working for a nation state. I know recently in the news, what did we see? North Korean actors who were getting hybrid work jobs for tech companies and then getting in the system and then downloading information. So you have these intentional threats, these nation state actor threats. You have threats that maybe are thought of and perpetuated by an individual. And then you have the accidental, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I accidentally sent Dave keys to the kingdom, or I sent him a model that we're working on, for the next diet, diet soda or something, so you have those intentional, unintentional, nation state fueled, individually raged fuel. And then I think something you see particularly from the physical side, and maybe we could talk about this for a minute, is the actor, the intent to do harm. If you think about the idea of like the pathway to violence, and you hear that a lot, maybe the threat assessment community, like Chuck or Dave was on a pathway to violence, and then at some point it erupted in some violent or terrible way. If you think about the pathway to violence, and that road to making a decision, it's very similar to insider. So at some point I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to do harm. I'm going to take information. I'm going to steal IP. I'm going to do something that might benefit myself, or I think is going to harm the company in such a way, or God forbid, I take a very dark turn and do something where I might wield a weapon or wield some type of, active shooter or active threat type situation.
Right. I mean, it just depends on the motivation and what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah. And the trouble there becomes like, how do we track those? How do we track that? How do we know, Dave, what decision Dave's going to make?
Yeah, exactly. And then I guess, backgrounds and things like that come into play, but also just, we are seeing sort of state actor issues coming in. And I'd say it's increasing, at least it seems like it is.
Well, I agree. I also think like the ability, I do think it's on the rise, and that's just my Kentucky windage. I mean, we could go out and, there's plenty of places we could go and say, let's look at the actual numbers. I also think the ability for us to see and comprehend it as citizens, both citizens in a security community, but then average citizens who are looking at going, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But yet at some level, it's been present for a very long time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is I guess just educating the organization that you're at on what to look for and just sort of, I guess, best practices on mitigating threats like that before they really pop up and become a crisis, right?
I think a lot of people, again, going back to like, oh, this is a cyber problem, or it's a cyber problem, or it's a cyber risk. And, I think risk doesn't care what your security title is. Are you the CISO? Are you the CSO? Are you the Intel manager? Are you the EP manager? Are you the site facility manager? It doesn't care. It's just looking for a gap in the wire. And once it gets in, it's going to get in and do what it will. So I think a robust way to think about insider now is like, you have to have an insider council. You have to have an insider committee that's holistic, and it looks at all the people in your organization, whether that's you and me, Dave, sitting around with a cup of coffee, talking about incidents that have rolled in over the weekend, or whether that's a multinational, 10-person committee that meets monthly and quarterly to go over governance issues and insider threat issues. And, what are our issues from nation state? What are our issues from, people that maybe are closer to, keys of the kingdom, IP code, et cetera. But I definitely think the way in which we need to look at it now is much more than that older binary kind of it's physical or it's cyber kind of issue.
No, I 100% agree. I think this is one of those unifying threat vectors that will unify both physical and cybersecurity. And like you said, maybe it's a committee and getting more of that CSO buy-in that has sort of both hands and on each side of that.
Well, if you think about it, think about it real quick, it's you're the CISO of the organization. I'm the CSO. What do I talk to this guy about? I don't know. He's a cyber guy. I'm a non-cyber guy. Or a cyber person. I'm a non-cyber person. Well, here's what we can have a cup of coffee on. Hey, let's, I mentioned earlier, common operating picture, and we have to have common operating language and information. Well, this is something we can get together, have a cup of coffee and say, hey, Dave, we haven't met, but I'd kind of like to pick your brain on insider risk. Do we say risk? Do we say threat? How do we think about it? What's your idea? And then start coming together with that shared definition from which we can then permeate to the rest of the organization. You know what I mean? It kind of brings all players to the table.
No, that's super important. And then, how do you roll out jointly your discussions with employees and then training and making awareness sort of a policy that goes forward from that? Because you can't get there unless you have those meetings and those huddles, with those two teams, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You need a joint assessment. Assessments, especially in terms of insider risk, or any assessment, in Randolph's opinion, it's not done in a silo. I mean, everything. I mean, I'm former military, as you know. Everything starts with an intel brief. So I think all issues that you're dealing with in security, or the majority of them, should start with some type of risk assessment. What are we looking at? What are the keys of the kingdom? What are our centers of gravity? Who's our key stakeholders? What's the current state of play? What are our goals and objectives for the program? And then who do we need to target? And I don't mean target in a harmful way, but who would we need to target in our own organization to get buy-in? Maybe it's an executive. Maybe it's some type of champion in an organization. Who knows? But I think that's where it all has to start.
Yeah. And then what are some of the, ways of mitigating these risks? What are some of the common scenarios?
Well, I mean, a lot of it starts, I think a lot of it, you've got, it starts with assessment, and then you have governance and policy framework. I mean, you hear the idea of like people, process, technology, people, what are we doing to A, identify at-risk individuals, B, identify individuals who are either primary, let's say executives, or tertiary, let's say executive assistants, chiefs of staff, people who are running code, people who literally have the keys to the next generation of whatever we're building.
Sure.
And then we have to have monitoring around it. What kind of monitoring and education, situational awareness. Where are you going? What are you saying? Who are you saying it to? What should you be on the lookout for in terms of people attempting maybe to get you, and also what should you be on the lookout for the greater community? Organizations, I'll come to the rest of it as an aside, though. I think organizations struggle with this, like, see something, say something, like, whoa, organizations, we're not Big Brother.
Right.
But we have to come to terms with this fact, like, it's not being Big Brother, but it's being a good brother or sister to your fellow employees and a good steward of the organization. Lost IP is lost IP. That's one thing. But, like we said earlier, if that turns into something violent and terrible, well, a lost life is a lost life. So I think it's important that we have that education. We start creating a culture around a risk-aware organization. You got to have, going back to the steps. I mean, you got to have risk monitoring. We have to understand, what are we looking for? What are the anomalies? And when I say risk monitoring, again, that's not so much a big brother, but it's about identifying anomalies in the system. I mean, if you and I are the two-person security team in an organization, and this is not an unrealistic scenario, we got a lot of stuff to do, man, every day. So we want to be able to come in and say, you want to be able to come in as the boss and say, Chuck, we had so-and-so who's an engineer that's key to the next version of Dave.com. He came in Sunday night at 2 a.m. That seems like an anomaly. And then we want to be able to go back and say, do we validate that this is normal behavior, or is this something that we need to look deeper into? And that, that's part of the detection and response that needs to happen. Like we need to have a shared understanding of what we're looking for, what the risk levels are, and then what the response is, so that we could say, like, before we bust down Dave's door and go, what were you doing here at 2 a.m.? We have the ability to kind of look at it and say, oh, by the way, Dave comes in every Sunday at 2 a.m. because that's when there's less people on the network. And, Dave tends to do his best work then because he's not drugged down by a system. I mean, kind of making that up, but I think you get what I'm saying. And then, of course, training.
That's a good point.
Yep.
That's a good point, because that kind of goes into the whole employee privacy standpoint, right? So it's like, what type of tools do you have to sort of verify an assumption that you're making before sort of going all the way, through an interview?
If you go in to clear a room, I can say this in the Defender community, because again, if you go in to clear a room and, everyone's half cocked or half not, and you go in and people start shooting, we don't even know what's going on, then likely something bad is going to happen. And it could be something bad for us. But if everyone's lined up, we know what we're looking for, we know what we're doing, then we can make decisions about what we're going to do when we walk or we go into that, unknown. And I think a lot of times, my perception is a lot of times a lot in our community maybe came from like a .gov, a .law enforcement, a .military background. And working in .com isn't always the same. If you're in a .le, you might, you're used to making an arrest. Maybe if you're .3-letter agency, you kind of want to fall back and see where it leads, because maybe there's something more there. And a lot of times in .com, they're just like, we just want it to go away, man. And we need to be the arbiters of figuring all that out to say, what are we seeing? What is it? How do we deal with it? Which goes back to like people, process, technology. Is this an HR issue? Is it a legal issue? Is this something we need to get our law enforcement partners involved in? And so I think there's a point in which if we have those like shared detection and response plans, it helps us, when an anomaly happens and we need to react to it. Of course, again, we said training and awareness. That's all about culture to me.
Yeah. Do
we have a culture of like, great, it's mandatory yearly, training briefings about insider and situational awareness, click, 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 click? Or are we creating a culture in which we understand, like, I am my sister and brother's keeper, they are mine, and we are all stewards of the organization, and we create a culture in which we realize that we're gatekeeping for ourselves? Because, as we know, you take China and their 5-year plan. The 5-year plan pretty much paints out what they're going to go after, and you can look at that and say, does our organization fit into this? Well, there are knowns there are known knowns, and we can help our organization, we can help our employee base understand, like, these are things that are at risk for us. Help us, secure them.
Yeah, and then that communication is important though with the entire team, right? Is just understanding, so they don't blow it off, that here's what's at risk. Here's some of the different scenarios that could happen, which is why everyone has to sort of help with being aware of that.
And I mean, I think you would agree with this too. Like, not everything has to be like. I think we always go to like it's. And by the way, this is not me saying that there isn't nation state issues. I mean, I'm the chairman of the Sam Houston State Critical Infrastructure Research Forum. 80% of critical infrastructure sits in private industry. And we know nation states go after it. So this is not me saying there's no nation state problem, but I'm saying, like, if you're always going to the most, like, I understand, like, the most dangerous course of action, most likely course of action, and then the most limited course of action. And I think we need to talk and to train to all those too, so our employee base doesn't see everything as, the spy in the corner, or
Right.
the sky is falling, or aliens are among us, or something. I mean, I think if we just can get our employee base to say, hey, I see an anomaly, I need to get this to somebody, I need it to get it to Dave and Chuck so they can look at it, and then they can help ferret out what the issue might be, if any.
Yeah, you kind of touched on just the possibility of going deeper on something too. So that's where you do find out, how far does this go, and what is this
Yep.
a larger issue, or is it just a small regional challenge with maybe somebody who was broke or whatever it is, that.
Well, yeah, Dave, you made me think of a great point there. I mean, maybe somebody's broke and they're trying to sell some information. Maybe it's another organization trying to come in, and now you're dealing with, espionage and corporate espionage activities, which runs tangential to insider risk. Or maybe it's a nation state that, hey, I don't need to hack into the system. I'll just pay Dave $80,000 and see if he'll let me tailgate in with him when he comes in to do his maintenance on the air conditioning unit, next Friday.
Sure. That, and like you were just saying, the sort of corporate espionage aspect is kind of interesting, because not a lot of people, at least I don't see a lot of people talking about that particular issue.
Yeah.
Usually, like you said, it's sort of the big stuff, right, that everyone highlights. But that's a real thing. So, how often is that going on, and just in your gauge?
It's not something that you hear of a lot, mostly because I think corporations, like, we need to keep this silent. One, because I don't want some other corporation to know I had a hole in my fence. But also, I think it's just in general bad for business. I think it happens. I was thinking, gosh, I wish we knew we were going to ask this question. I would have researched. I'm thinking of there was a Yahoo episode, or there's an episode with Yahoo where an engineer knew he was leaving, and he took, and I'm going to mess this up just so you know, and people can look it up, where the individual basically took the equivalent of, like, more than 100 copies of War and Peace in data, but took it out, like, on a thumb drive, and quit, and thought, I'll just take it with me to the next company. And now, was that company expecting it to come with him? I don't know, but he was caught. He was an engineer. He was caught. Bad things happen to him. But I mean, that also happens too. Hey, I'm leaving. I'm gonna, it's hard, Dave. I'm leaving. I worked on a bunch of stuff for you. I'm just gonna copy it, because you don't know when I go to the next place. I don't want to have to reinvent my own wheel. Don't worry. I'm gonna change the names and the titles. But it, again, is that insider? One could argue it is.
Yeah, I saw something. I won't say the name, but it was an inside leak. So this is another sort of angle, right, where information is leaked out into the public eye. That is obviously bad for business for the company, and now everyone's sort of siphoning through that to sort of get an idea of what they're doing, and sort of the the insight on how they're managing algorithms or what have you. So,
well, this is scary too, because I know we talk about artificial intelligence, and it's the big evil, or maybe Skynet. I mean, I think theoretically Skynet came online, if you're a fan of the Terminator, I think a couple of weeks ago, and you follow the movie. But I think AI just is. But if you have terabytes of information that you've walked away from, now you can plug that into an AI model and start extrapolating information from that. And maybe from that, you can derive patterns, you can derive important things, or even forecast company moves. So it is I don't want to say frightening, but I would say, and I don't even think alarming is the word, because I think most people probably watching this are like, yeah, these are things that I'm thinking about every day, you guys. But it's here. and it's like when I remember when the idea of like the cyber breach came out, and I remember an executive saying like, oh, when is this going to go away? And I was like, never. I mean, it's, Pandora's box is open. This is one more that jumped out, and it's here. Yeah.
Well, and that sort of gets us to, you mentioned people, process, technology. On the technology side, what's in the arsenal for the security director in terms of tools that they have to sort of look at this stuff and see what's going on?
Yeah, I think a lot of insider threat activity or counter insider threat or whatever cool operator word we want to use. But like, again, we were talking about monitoring. Insider threat is a lot of case management too. Like if an anomaly posts about Chuck and it goes back to you, Dave, I mean, how are we keeping the record of, again, it's not Big Brother on Chuck, but there's an anomaly. And an anomaly would let us know that there's a pattern. So we need to understand, like, what are the patterns? What are the anomalies? What is the case? Did we close the case? Who was involved? Because if it does say, going back to your point, Dave, if it comes back to like, oh, Chuck is stealing information to take over to Bill.com or to William.com from Dave.com, well, that might end in legal. It's definitely going to end in me probably getting fired, but it could end in legal issues. It could end in you notifying the FBI of what I'm doing, which could lead to a lot of things. So we have to have a case management system that allows us to say, are we tracking? Do we know what's going on? Are we hydrating the case? Do we understand what's happening around it? That also goes for monitoring too. If you and I are a couple of engineers working on, the next solar powered full house generator, we might want to do a little extra monitoring around what's being said about us or what might be put out there on social media. And it goes back to, are we looking, are we developing patterns? So I think you got to have, technology has to be able to allow you to do monitoring, strategically or tactically. You've got to be able to ingest information and do anomaly management in the form of cases. And then you got to be able to do reporting. Who needs to know? What do we see? Who have I told? Who needs to know? Kind of thing.
Well, you hit on something that made me think of, you see these school shootings and they usually go to Discord, their search history, things like that. Well, likewise on an insider threat, are there tools where you're looking out across, because, as the generations get younger, the tools of what you need to look for also changes. Absolutely. So, you're looking at social media, obviously, but Discord is probably not something that a lot of people think about.
Well,
but that's a way to huddle and maybe talk. Maybe it's whether it's espionage of one degree or another, getting an idea of those things, and then maybe local law enforcement gets involved as per the company or whatever.
Yeah.
But those are the tools I'm thinking of.
You're absolutely right. And, you go to these fringe sites, like for a while, if we said social media 7 years ago, it's Facebook, and then Facebook and Twitter, and now it's X. You have Mastodon, you have 4chan, 8chan, Discord, Reddit, all these places. WhatsApp, and then if you include WhatsApp, texting, and other like even more fringier things, if I can use that word. But you're right. You're absolutely right. It evolves, and it evolves with the generations, and it evolves with the cultures. You think of, I saw something that came across my desk, and I actually noted it to go kind of do some fact checking around it and read about it, where somebody was arrested posting some things on Roblox, which, anyone that has an 8-year-old is familiar with Roblox. Yeah. But then you have Minecraft, you have, Xbox, PlayStation, all these places where, like you said, where I can go online and I can say, hey, Dave, meet me in the corner of this map on, whatever online game we're playing, and then we go to the corner of a map and we have a conversation. There's no monitoring around that.
Yeah.
There's no, you're absolutely right. The modes of communications are changing constantly, and our technology needs to be able to ingest that and again, track that. Sorry.
No, I think that's the $1 million question though, is, what kind of software can we have that does track all of these different vectors? And that means, and it kind of gets back to the employee privacy part of, how much are you able to do within the organization outside of tapping law enforcement, which has those tools, right?
Yep. But you bring up a good point about, let's say, people, the defender community watching, listening in here. We do a couple of things I think that are like superpowers, if you will, of the security practitioner or the protector or defender community. One, we solve problems in a heartbeat. Like if you're a good defender, you're doing critical analysis and course of action analysis in a New York second, where it can take some organization weeks to come up with that. I'm not saying we're always making the best decisions, but if something is happening in the moment, your brain is already clicking into what's my options, what's happening, what's my options, what do I need to do, who's getting, and it's just how our brains are wired, I think. And the next thing we do, which is a superpower, is, how many, stop me if you've heard this one before. Hey, as this comes out, I'll be an ASIS or ASIS at GSX. One of the biggest things at a conference like that, or the Close Protection Conference or OSAC or something, is the networking. We have tremendous networks. So if Dave.com is having a problem, we realize like this is, I go back to Sony. Oh, well, hell's bells. DPRK is trying to hack us or is hacking us. No problem. Dave can pick up the phone and call his Engage's network and say, I'm going to find somebody at the Bureau or find somebody in the Secret Service or find somebody in local law enforcement that I can work with that I can either pass this off on or is going to help us get through this. The power of the network of the security practitioner is something I think we as a community should never take for granted.
Yeah, I think you and I were sort of talking about that last week, where it's unlike any other community because it stretches across all of these different industries, and yet there's that common thread through all of it in terms of just I think the mindset, number one, like you touched on, it's people who really care about what we do, and then having that sort of insight to look at things a little bit differently than maybe most folks do. Well,
Dave, look at what you've done with the defender community. You started it because you felt it here and said, okay, now we have, I think we were talking last week, when we started doing Conversations in Close Protection podcast back in 2015 or whatever, it was just out of a desire to say, look, we need to create history from the protector community because we have a shared history, but we're not tracking and we're not capturing these stories. Now I look at you and I were talking the other week, what you're doing here to say, look, I'm doing this because I feel it. And there's voices that are trying to speak for the community that really don't come of the community. So like all the things you're doing here, like by, with, and for the community, I think are remarkable. And it speaks to the power of the network and the power to have more open conversations about what we as defenders see and think and feel.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's just nothing like that. And again, everybody's wired a little bit differently than most folks, perhaps, because I think there's just a deep desire from a lot of people involved in the security industry to help others and to make things better. Whether that means safer or protecting those around you. So that's a higher calling.
Yeah,
sure.
Look, what can we learn from Girl Scouts? Always make it better than you got there, or Marines, I guess. It's funny though, like my wife and I are both in the industry. So, it's often like our dinner time conversations are sometimes very interesting and sometimes very mundane, like who's taking who to soccer practice. But it is, and it does strike me about this community more than others is the way that we kind of hold the idea of, defending, protecting, close to our hearts.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of just, I guess, before we put a attack in this one, maybe we'll continue talking about it in the future, especially maybe some things will come back from GSX. But is there anything else you feel that we didn't cover on insider threats that we should just sort of put together for the folks that are listening in?
Yeah, you know, as I, you know, I at Ontic, I'm fortunate enough to go out and to deal with a lot of my peers in the industry, and you know, I'm building programs just like they are, and I find a lot just like listening and understanding with a critical eye what they're doing. And I would say, like, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, man, my boss has told me we talked about insider, we're not big enough, or we're too big of that. You're never too small to start, and don't think of it as an insurmountable, an insurmountable process that you have to build. Just it goes back to understanding, like, what is it that we're protecting? What is it we need to know? What are our objectives? Who do I need to bring to the table? And just start there and start having conversations. And it is, I guess, don't let it, like my good friend says, don't let it become dark art or dark magic, because it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, it can get overwhelming too. You
Yeah.
feel like it has to be this all encompassing, but just getting started is usually half the battle, and then it sort of builds onto it.
And you're right. You're absolutely right. And it can be a core of a lot of things. Like, it could be a core committee that understands, like, in my small company, like, here's how we do investigations. Here's how we do employee investigations. Here's how we do audit. Here's how we do insider threat. And you can all start in one little core. And then as your organization builds, you build. And then if you go on to the next role, the next job, or the next something else, you just scale it up and keep rinsing and repeating. But it is there. And I think it's something that we all need to consider, whether you're running a small residential team somewhere out in the West Coast, or whether you're running a multi-million-dollar multinational organization that's, dealing with supply chain. I mean, it's something that needs to be on all of our radar.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of which, what else is on your radar in terms of just security and things that you're seeing out there that they're kind of interesting you?
Well, of course, the election. I mean, the election is coming. Wherever you sit on the political spectrum, I mean, the election is coming, and it is the year of the election all over the world. I think it's also the year of. I also think it's the year of geopolitics striking back. I mean, a lot of times, what we've seen is corporations really don't want to play in that geopolitical realm, but geopolitics is having its way with many organizations. I personally ponder a lot about asymmetric threat. I remember, I'm an old information operations guy. I remember asymmetric was a word we used in the military, and then it kind of went away, just like convergence. But I think both of those terms are coming back, asymmetric threats, in terms of, again, we're talking about critical infrastructures or organizations. What does that mean? Insider, direct, cyber, legal. What are the ways that risk is coming at us? And then also convergence, I think, is something that is getting, for the longest time, I think people talked about convergence, but now I think it's here. And I think it's something that's rapidly becoming a demand, if you will. Like, we need converged organizations. We need converged conversations. We need, common operating pictures and things, so that we can enable decision makers about risk. Because risk, I mean, going all the way back to the beginning of, this discussion, I mean, it just seems like we're in the never-ending cycle of how's the quote go? What fresh hell is this? Which was a quote from a woman who was trying to get her book published, and she would get a package from one of her publishers and think, what fresh hell is this? And I think a lot of leaders and a lot of risk folks listening in on this are probably like, they wake up every day and go, what now?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so, that kind of gets into, as well as just the breadth of all of these different departments you're working with. And obviously, the larger the organization, the harder this is. But you just mentioned, you have all of these different people involved, and convergence is, part of that is playing nice with the other departments. And then obviously it has a technology aspect to it as well, which has been sort of drummed in my head for the last 15 years. But, I think just understanding how it just seems like everything sort of has evolved so rapidly in terms of how this is changing. how you're dealing with these organizations, or how they're dealing with interorganizational um, groups and getting together. Like you kind of mentioned HR. Obviously, that's a huge one to work with. What are some of the other things that
HR,
you're seeing, I
legal.
guess, on that converge?
Well, think about it. I mean, you know, where I work now, I mean, one of our visions is transformation, helping organizations transform, and I think part of that is unifying. Like, look, we could call it a federated approach. I prefer the term a unified approach to risk. You know, HR, legal, facilities, cyber, physical, sales. I mean, where are all the one of the organizations before I came to Ontic, an organization I worked at, I said I started a strategic intel team because the CISO said, "Hey, look, we're getting a lot of threat signals, and I just, there's a lot of whack-a-mole, and I want to understand not how to think. I know how to do that, but what should I be thinking about?" And that stuck with me because there's so much coming at decision makers, C-suite folks, whatever we want to call it. And I think our job, our new mantra, and our new obsession, maybe, if you think about Lencioni's 4 obsessions, one of our obsessions should be about, again, joint information, joint language, and a common operating picture, so that when we go back to the CEO of Dave.com and go, "Dave, here's what we're seeing. We've all the risk partners have come together. Here's what we're seeing. Here's courses of action. Most deadly, most likely, here's what we think." And now you can make a decision more rapidly and enable you to make that decision, as opposed to saying, like, "Wait, HR just said this. You're saying this. The cyber team said that. Legal hasn't even weighed in. Like, I don't even know who to listen to." And I think
Yeah.
the physical security person is placed well to kind of be that connector. In information operations, a lot of time, one of the biggest things we had to overcome was just synchronizing. And I think about that a lot in the physical security space too. Our job is also synchronizing, like bringing all the voices together and say, "Okay, we've got the chorus here or the band. Let's make sure we're all playing music well."
Yeah, I guess that just means, having sort of that, like you stated earlier, a committee with all those different department heads, so you can sort of have those conversations and understand exactly what's going on everywhere. So you're not going to each one individually. I mean, it speeds up that process a lot.
Oh my gosh. I mean, if you think about, the organizational flinch, hey, we've had something happen, and, like somebody just punched us in the face organizationally, and, we rear back, we flinch. That now creates time, that now creates space, that now, and now we're getting further right of the incident. And I know everyone wants to get left of bang and all those things, but I think what we need in order to get left of an incident, we first need to be able to understand, how do we get through the incident immediately? How do we fight the flinch response organization? How do we practice? How do we bring all the people to the table so that in something happens in the organization that's risk-based, we're immediately going into what we've trained, what we've talked about, the education and the culture we've built to say, we've got this. Everybody gets together, silos are at the table, and in a happy world, we're looking at the risk from the same way, and we're saying, "Okay, boss, this has just happened. Here's what we think. Here's the options. Tell us which one you want us to go with, and we'll do it." Now, I realize that's pie in the sky stuff, Dave, but I feel that we're slowly getting there.
Yeah, no, I think we are. I think we're seeing big shifts in terms of how organizations are getting through things like this. And it seems, I don't know, it just seems like things are more common in terms of things that we've seen. We haven't seen things like this for a long time, where it seems like over and over we're getting bigger and bigger challenges ahead of us. And,
do you think people are anticipating it now, as opposed to where we're waiting for it to happen? I mean, what do you talk to a lot of folks too? I mean, what do you think? Do you think organizations are more in an anticipatory, not if, but when?
I think the last 5 years have been unprecedented, and sort of at that level, it's sort of heightened everybody's awareness of what's possible. And then on top of that, you have information that is spread so quickly that half the battle is challenging sort of maybe the wrong thinking or disinformation that went out on something. So it becomes a more complicated world as things happen so much faster, and it's hard to get. Sorry, like you said, you're trying to catch up with what just happened, and then at the same time, you're sort of dealing with a lot of aspects that maybe we never had to worry about before.
No, that's great. I mean, you think about like crisis doesn't happen and the other one's outside the door waiting its turn. I'm trying to think back in my own time when, like you've got multiple things happening. We've got hurricanes happening here and it affects a plant that's maybe manufacturing something for us. Oh, by the way, over here we have something going on and there's a worker strike or there's a rail strike that's preventing, and the rail is maybe a center of gravity for our supply chain, and on top of that, hey, it's promotion season or budget season or, name your business function that needs to happen here. So there's probably never a dull moment for most.
No, I mean, I just think about, whether it's budget cuts and then headcount happens, right? Where that's reduced. And then that you have, that threat of an insider now taking, like you were saying earlier, IP out of that company. So there's just a lot happening right now. It just seems like it's high speed, in terms of.
Well, and I mean, probably for some other time, but I mean, there's a whole continuity discussion in that too. And technology has the ability to help us, hey, I've got 5 people on my team doing investigations today. Tomorrow I have 3. Well, but I still have the workload of those 5,
sure,
or 10 or whatever that is, or, whether it's, risk monitoring or maybe it's, maybe it's a guard force. I mean, whatever that is, the reduction in force doesn't create a reduction in work and definitely doesn't create a reduction in risk. In fact, it probably creates more as we try to leap over the gap to, a redacted or reduced workforce.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, in a sort of strange way, that almost leads into leveraging things like AI that makes us faster, better at grabbing information that we had to manually go through. Those things are extremely time intensive. And so whether it's looking through video to capture that incident, if it's done a lot faster, that's a good thing. Or maybe it's robotics that's augmenting, like you were saying, maybe a guard force. So now, there's an increase in efficiency there. So it's pretty interesting how it's a combination of all these things all at one time.
No, I think you said it earlier. We're rapidly. I mean, what was it like? Information is the new oil, or data is the new oil. We're rapidly moving through that, and we're rapid. I mean, I think the term you hear something like "I'm a data-driven organization." That was kind of a buzzword maybe 5 years ago, and now it's yeah, dude, everyone is.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not, you're out of business.
Yeah, or you're getting retired. So you're absolutely right. I don't know. It's interesting times. I mean, I believe we're on the cusp of some type of renaissance in security leadership. What that ultimately will be, I think, is to be seen. But I think if we as an organization play it right and we can come together as an industry, I actually think we can position the physical security folks to be far more of a connector and a facilitator than we have been in decades.
Yeah, I honestly, I see physical security more important than it ever has been.
Yeah.
Because it's a combination of, there's a lot of technology that's been introduced that's made, I think, well, it's 2 things, right? So it's just the age of that we're in terms of data and the things you're talking about, and a lot of technology. But then you have security as an overlay, has to have tools that adapt to this. And so, I look at what's going on with, you mentioned critical infrastructure. That's like a huge subject for me. And I look at that and some of the risks associated with that. Thank goodness there is some technology, but it takes the mindset of skilled physical security folks to go out there and really understand how to assess these threats and what's needed.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's not all tech. Maybe it's a concrete wall that's a good solution, right? So I think there's really no replacement for the physical security
Well, that
manager.
mindset, yeah,
Yeah.
that mindset, like you said, like, look, and I don't think we're talking about we're going to come out and pen test and kidnap everybody that works at this building, but just from that like mirror image mindset where we're walking around saying, okay, what is it? I think you said something that I think is profound or should be underscored, is which sometimes the simplest, detect, deter, defend, disrupt, deny. Sometimes the simplest thing is the simplest thing. Maybe it's a concrete wall. Well, no, but if we spend all this stuff, we put all these cameras, or what if we just put up a concrete wall? You know, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's brilliant. I wanted to make sure that like we restated that, because sometimes it is we get caught up in like the most complex one. It is the simplest thing. And I think to your point, the physical security folks, I'm not saying we're simple minded. I'm just saying we're critical thinkers, and we have the ability to come in and say, okay, wait, I'm not going to be hampered. I'm, as my good friend Shane Stewart would say, I'm going to come in with a clear eyes approach and just walk in and say, what do I assess? And then how can we mitigate?
It wasn't concrete a technology that was a kept secret for a long time as well, right? So that was I think it went 1,000 years, rediscovered by the British, and they kept that as a secret for a while. So
naturally, the Brits. I'm actually going to be in London in October 10th. There's the IPSB, the International Protective Security Board. We've got our second it's a cool symbol. This is not like it's kind of a subtle plug, but I think it's interesting along kind of what I hear you talk about on these pods and what you and I've talked about offline too, which is like it brings together threat management folks, security operations leaders, and intelligence analysts, all of like manager level above you. Like we have the threat informed, intelligence driven, operations led mantra to say, look, let's all, like we were saying earlier, let's all talk about risks, try to come out of this with a shared understanding, so that when we're going back to our organizations or we're going back in the industry, we kind of understand, like, here's what the threat assessment folks are seeing, or the threat assessment professionals, and then here's what the intel analysts are seeing, and then at the the pointy end of things, here's what the folks on the ground are needing. So I'm excited. I'm going to bring up your cement wall thing there. I'll give you credit though.
You don't have to. Hey, I was going to say, you're a moving target. There's a lot of adventure going to.
There is a lot happening. It's the beginning of the travel. It's beginning of travel time, and then it'll keep going. Of course, the day job never stops. Security never rests. So there's the day job and travel, and goes right up through the holidays. And then I think I'm going to disappear in a cave somewhere.
One could hope, right, that we could get away just for 1 minute, but it's always difficult. Well, it was great talking to you. I really appreciate your insights, Chuck. We'll have to do this more often. Is there anything? Just you sort of know what we're doing, obviously, with Defender, and Defender is everybody listening. So what would you like to see on Defender? I'd love to see, we were sort of talking a little bit about maybe putting some information out there for folks to read, because this is an all-inclusive environment where it's crowdsourced, right? So that's really the
you've had some tremendous guests, and I'm a follower, and again, Dave, I love what you're doing.
I appreciate that,
because I know you're a critical infrastructure geek like me. I'd love to, and we can take it offline. There's a couple of folks I'd love to get, but I'd love to see you do like a Defender panel of like, let's take a physical, a cyber, and somebody else from critical infrastructure, and to kind of have a deep dive into that. I think it'd be fascinating, especially with your background. It would add to the conversation, and I'd want to see you run that panel or insert yourself in it. But that's something, as I was watching some of the stuff over the weekend and as I've been following you, I mean, that's something I'd love to see a little bit more of.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to do something in person too, and live versus always.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah.
Count me in.
Thanks I would love it. Thanks, Chuck, for coming on and sharing your insights with everybody. I really appreciate it. And how can people I want to make sure that they knew about your podcast. It's been on a lot longer than mine. So if you have that information, that'd be great. If not, if you throw me the link, I will put that in at least in the video. And
you can find it, Conversations in Close Protection. It's easy to find. I'm also one of the hosts of the Ontic Protective Intelligence podcast. You can find that easily. Dave, the best way to just go to LinkedIn. I pretty much try to put the stuff I'm working on or things I'm interested there, or you can find me or all the stuff I'm interested easily from there. And of course, and I've got my contact information on there too. And I'm happy to help anybody out if I have time.
Excellent. Well, everybody can watch this. If they go to the Defender site, it's defender.video for the video links to all the podcasts. So you can go there and watch it instead of just listen, or you can just listen, depending on your preference there. But we'll try to make some information available. You and I have a plan of possibly having an article with a clip from this on there as well. So that
I've got some ideas now that we've been talking.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to sharing all this information with everybody out there. And if anybody else has ideas, I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, thanks for watching Defender.